This last week on the Pod Meets World podcast, the host talked about something that I don't think is spoken about enough within the entertainment industry, and that's their treatment of children within Hollywood. Now, this is kind of reminds me of the metoo movement, where the whole casting couch and that kind of thing was almost considered an open secret within Hollywood until people decided that it's like, okay, this is actually a bad thing. And what they were talking about within this episode of their podcast, I think, is the next big open secret that I don't think actually gets enough attention within the entertainment industry, and is something that really needs to be addressed because it is pretty much a plot on humanity that will allow people like this to continue to do what they do. Now, for people who don't know, the Pod Meets World podcast is hosted by three of the stars of the series Boy Meets World. Now, if you're somewhat in my age bracket, which is the older millennial, younger Gen X type age demographic, then you probably grew up watching this show like I did. And it is kind of interesting to see this podcast where it's basically the stars of the show kind of going back, rewatching episodes and reminiscing about what was going on with them while they were making those episodes and their reactions to watching these episodes as adults, something that they were making when they were children. So I think that's kind of cool. But this last week, they were going through an episode that featured an actor who turned out to be, let's say, a little bit unsavory when it comes to children, and he was later convicted of such crimes. And they were kind of talking about how they befriended this guy and they were really shocked that this actually happened with him. And even to the point where they were initially defending him when these allegations first came about. And now they're kind of dealing with that now that they're a little bit older. But let's get into this article. On Monday, the light tone of Pod Meets World, the podcast that takes an anecdote-filled walk through the episodes of the hit sitcom Boy Meets World, got serious as the host and former sitcom star discussed grooming, the manipulation of minors, and their friendship with the convicted child abuser who they befriended when he guest starred on the show. This reminds me a bit of the show itself because for the most part, it's usually pretty lighthearted and fun, but there are occasionally the episodes that have some heavy subject matter that really hits home, especially as they get a little bit older in the series. But let's continue. The podcast is hosted by Danielle Fishel, Ryder Strong, and Will Friedle, who as children starred in the series Boy Meets World. This last week on their podcast, they had Katie Morton on, who the article describes as a family therapist. And during that time, they were also discussing child abuse and other things like that going on within the industry. Because during the run of the series, there was a 2-episode arc where they had guest star Brian Peck on the show. And during that time frame, Ryder Strong and Will Friedle kind of became friends with him, even though he's like 20 years older than them. And I think they were maybe in their mid to late teens at the time frame of that. So that's a little bit suspicious if you ask me. But, they kind of go into why a lot of people didn't necessarily think that was suspicious. But in 2003, Peck was accused of doing stuff to children and was later convicted and sentenced to 16 months in prison. Personally, I think 16 months is kind of a light sentence for what someone who does stuff to children probably deserves. Will Friedle and Ryder Strong talked about how they kind of quickly became friends with Brian Peck and how they would used to hang out with him all the time on set and then outside of work and things like that. And here it says, Friedle recalls on the podcast how well Peck maneuvered into his life. I was working a lot after Boy Meets World, and this guy had so ingrained himself into my life. I took him to 3 shows after Boy Meets World, Friedle said. Friedle described Peck as someone who really was able to present himself in one way, kind of as like a funny guy who was good at his job and things like that. But obviously, secretly, he had ulterior motives when it comes to younger boys. During their discussion, the host kind of speculated about why they think adults, especially parents and other things like that, would allow this guy to hang around with teenagers. And they think it has to do with the fact that Peck was an out gay guy. And they describe at the time frame, which was the mid to late 90s, there was kind of a fluid attitude towards the gay community. There was probably a part of them that didn't say it because they were afraid it was going to be taken as homophobia instead of, this is a boundary, gay or not. This is a boundary between adults and kids, Fishel said. And to me, this whole cancel culture aspect is probably the worst part of this whole situation, but I'm going to circle back to that. Let's just kind of finish this up too, because there's not a whole lot left. The actors also discussed the manipulative tactics they say were used on them by Peck, who was helping Fishel's career at the time he was accused of the crimes in 2003. Peck, according to the host, reversed the situation in his version, so he was the real victim, they said. The article then goes on to talk about how they defended him personally as well as publicly in court, where they literally testified on his behalf, and to which the host of this really regretted. Now, I'm not necessarily going to begrudge them for that because at the time they were probably in their early 20s. So, I mean, very much still children. And I can understand a friend is accused of something. So you just immediately go to their defense of this and you don't necessarily think about it. Then years later, as an adult, you kind of think back and you're like, yeah, that wasn't the right move. So it's like, at least they can admit now it was wrong to defend him. But still, I mean, that's something that they have to deal with. And it seems like that's really what they're doing. But I want to go back to the whole cancel culture aspect to this, because even though cancel culture as a term is still fairly new, what it actually is nothing new. As we can see from this article, this was in the mid to late 90s. And even then, cancel culture was very much a thing where people were afraid of calling out a gay guy who's having an inappropriate relationship with children because they didn't want to be called homophobic. Versus if this was a straight guy, then yeah, they would have called him out for seeing children outside of work and stuff like that. And no one would have batted an eye at that. But because it's a gay guy, it's like, he's a protected class. We can't do that. And it's still the same thing nowadays, except you can also throw in transphobic there too, which to me, that also really does a disservice to those communities. Because if you're basically saying in that community, if you're against adults in this community hanging out with children in this type of manner, well, then it makes it seem like that's not a very good community. If everyone agrees that behavior that would ordinarily be inappropriate is allowable because that person is within the LGBT community, well, then it just suggests that maybe that's not a good group. And I know that's not actually the case because I've known people who are in those groups who don't actually think that way, who are thinking, yeah, you shouldn't have certain relationships with children if you're an adult. And I think there needs to be more people calling this stuff out, especially within the entertainment industry, because this has been a big problem in the entertainment industry. The open secret in the past was there's the casting couches going on until metoo movement kind of interrupted that. And now this is the next big open secret. And it's really going to take some high profile people calling this out in order to stop it. I'm not saying they're the most high profile people. I mean, they were on a popular show in the 90s and now they host their podcast. But still, it's good to see people within the entertainment industry actually calling this out, because there is that fear going on that people don't want to get labeled homophobic or transphobic or whatever kind of label or get canceled. But I think as more and more people kind of get the courage to step up and call this stuff out, then I think we'll start seeing a cascading effect where people will be like, yeah, I don't care if you're going to give me this label or anything like that. We need to do something about this, because there's certain relationship and certain boundaries between adults and children that need to be maintained. And even if the relationship is benign, if it gives the impression that there's something wrong going on, I think people should actually say something about it and not allow that to happen within the entertainment industry or actually just in society in general. And I think we will start seeing something with this later on down the line, but it really is going to take the courage of the few to get things started. And right now with what they did on their podcast, I think that's a good start. And it's just a matter of time before we start seeing more people follow suit.